The bakery had been closed for 3 weeks when Clara arrived. She stood in front of it with a suitcase in one hand and a key in the other. The sign above the door said, "Novak Bakery," and the letters were faded and cracked from years of sun and rain. The windows were dark. A thin layer of dust covered the glass. Clara was 24 years old. She had studied business in the city and had been working at a desk for 2 years. She was good at numbers, good at schedules, good at making plans and following them. She had never baked anything more complicated than a birthday cake from a box. But her grandmother, Irena, had died 6 weeks ago, and she had left Clara everything: the bakery, the small apartment above it, and a handwritten recipe book with a brown leather cover. Clara had not planned to come here. She had planned to sell the building and go back to her life. Her boss had given her a week off. Her plan was simple: come to the town, meet the lawyer, sign the papers, leave. But something had stopped her. She was not sure what. Perhaps it was the way her mother had described the bakery when Clara was a child, the warm smell that filled the whole street, the line of people every morning, the way Irena knew every customer by name and asked about their children and their gardens and their health. Perhaps it was the recipe book itself, which Clara had opened on the train and could not stop reading. Her grandmother's handwriting was small and neat, and between the recipes were notes, not instructions but memories, small sentences written in the margins, like messages left behind for someone who might one day need them. One note, beside a recipe for rye bread, said, "This was your grandfather's favorite. He would eat half a loaf before it cooled down. I always baked 2, one for him, one for the shop." Another, beside a recipe for a holiday bread with raisins, said, "Mrs. Kowalski orders this every December. She says it tastes like her mother's kitchen. I have never met her mother." Clara put the key in the lock. It turned with effort. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was still and heavy. The ovens were cold. The wooden counter was dusty but solid, made from dark oak that had been polished by decades of use. Behind the counter, the shelves were empty. On the wall, there was a photograph of a woman standing in front of the same counter, holding a loaf of bread in both hands. The woman was smiling, not for the camera, but because she was happy. It was Irena, perhaps 30 years ago. Clara set her suitcase down and looked around. The kitchen behind the shop was large and clean, with white tiles on the walls and a stone floor worn smooth by years of footsteps. 2 big ovens stood side by side against the far wall. A long wooden table ran down the center of the room, its surface scarred and flour-stained from thousands of loaves. Everything was old. Everything was solid. Everything was waiting. She did not know where to begin. She spent the first 3 days cleaning. She scrubbed the floors on her hands and knees. She wiped the shelves with a damp cloth until the wood shone again. She washed the windows inside and out until the light came through properly for the first time in weeks. She cleaned the 2 large ovens, pulling out the racks, scraping the old crusts from the bottom, wiping the glass doors. They were heavy and old and slow to heat, but they worked. She found bags of flour in the storage room that had gone stale and gray and threw them away. She found jars of yeast that had dried out. She made a list of what she needed and drove to the nearest town to buy supplies. The small apartment above the bakery had 2 rooms, a bedroom and a kitchen with a table by the window. Irena's things were still there. Her clothes hung in the wardrobe. Her reading glasses sat on the kitchen table. A calendar on the wall was still showing the month she had died. Clara did not move any of these things yet. She was not ready. On the 4th day, she opened the recipe book. The first recipe was for a simple white loaf. Irena had written the ingredients in a clear list: flour, water, salt, yeast, and below them step-by-step instructions. But in the margin, she had added a note in smaller handwriting: "Do not rush the dough. It will tell you when it is ready. You have to learn to listen with your hands."
Clara read the note twice. She did not understand what it meant, but she gathered the ingredients, measured them carefully with a kitchen scale, and began. Her first loaf was a disaster. The dough was too wet, and she added too much flour to fix it, which made it stiff and heavy. She kneaded it the way she thought bread should be kneaded, fast and hard, pushing her weight into it. She put it in the oven and waited. When she took it out, it looked like a stone. She broke it open. The inside was dense and gray. She threw it away. Her second loaf was better, but still wrong. The shape was uneven, and the crust was too thick and too dark. She ate a piece of it with butter. It tasted like bread, but ordinary bread, the kind you buy in a plastic bag at a supermarket. Not like the bread her mother had described, the kind that made people walk across town just to buy a loaf. She tried again the next day, and the day after that. Each time she read her grandmother's notes more carefully, looking for the things she had missed. Each time the bread was a little better, but never quite right. The shape improved, but the taste was still flat. The crust looked better, but the inside was too tight, too heavy. She stood in the kitchen surrounded by failed loaves and wondered if she was foolish to think she could do this, a woman who had spent 2 years behind a computer screen trying to learn in a few days what her grandmother had spent a lifetime perfecting. At the end of each day, she climbed the stairs to the apartment above and sat at Irina's kitchen table. She looked out the window at the quiet street below. The town was small and slow, and nothing seemed to happen quickly here. Cars passed rarely, people walked instead. The same faces appeared at the same times in the same places. It was a different world from the city, where everything moved so fast that you could forget what day it was.
On the 7th day, a man knocked on the door. Clara was covered in flour, and her hair was tied back with a piece of cloth. She opened the door and found an old man standing outside. He was tall and thin, with a gray coat and a flat cap, and eyes that looked like they had been watching things carefully for a very long time. He looked at her with curiosity. He told her his name was Joseph, and that he had been a friend of Irina's for 40 years. They had grown up on the same street. He had seen the lights on in the bakery from his house across the road and had come to see who was inside. Clara invited him in. He stepped through the door slowly and looked around the clean shop. He ran his hand along the counter, the way someone touches something they have not seen in a while. He nodded slowly. He told her the place looked good. Then he looked at the counter where Clara's latest attempt at bread was sitting, a third loaf, better than the first 2, but still not right. The crust was a shade too pale, and the shape was slightly flat on one side. He asked if he could try a piece. She cut him a slice. He chewed it slowly and carefully, the way someone tastes wine, with attention, with his eyes half closed. Then he set it down. He told her it was not bad, but it was not Irina's bread. He said this without cruelty, simply as a fact. Irina's bread had been different, he explained. It was not just about the recipe, it was about how she made it, the way she handled the dough with gentle, unhurried hands, the time she gave it to rest and rise, the temperature she felt with the back of her hand against the oven door instead of measuring with a number. She had learned from her own mother, and her mother had learned from hers. It was knowledge that lived in the body, not on the page. Clara felt discouraged. She asked Joseph if he thought she could learn. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something she would think about for weeks. He said that Irina had always believed bread remembered the hands that made it. Good bread came from hands that were calm and patient. The dough could feel when someone was rushing, and it would not rise properly. It could feel when someone was afraid or uncertain, and it would not hold its shape. Clara was not sure she believed this. It sounded like something from a story, not from real life.
But Joseph had known Irena for 40 years, and he had eaten her bread hundreds of times, and there was a certainty in his voice that Clara could not ignore. After he left, she stood alone in the bakery for a long time. The clocks on the wall ticked quietly. The ovens were still warm. She looked at the recipe book again and turned to a page near the middle where Irena had written, "The secret is not in the recipe. The secret is in the waiting."
She changed her approach after that. She stopped trying to be fast. She stopped measuring everything with exact precision and began to use her hands more, feeling the dough instead of watching the clock, pressing it gently instead of pulling it apart. She let it rest longer than the recipe said because the dough seemed to need more time in the cool air of the old bakery. She watched the way it changed as it rested, how the surface became smoother, how small bubbles appeared just below the skin, how it grew slowly and quietly, like something alive. She paid attention to things she had not noticed before. The temperature of the water mattered. Too hot and the yeast would die. Too cold and it would not wake up. The way she folded the dough mattered. Gentle turns, not rough pulls. Even the surface of the table mattered. Irena had used the same wooden table for decades, and the wood had absorbed years of flour and oil until it had become part of the process itself. Clara began to understand that baking was not a science with exact rules. It was a conversation between the baker and the dough did not speak in words. It spoke in texture, in weight, in the way it felt against her palms. On the 10th day, something changed. The dough felt different under her hands. It was softer, smoother, and it moved with her instead of against her. When she pressed it, it pushed back gently, as if it were breathing. She shaped it slowly and placed it in the oven. When she took it out 40 minutes later, the crust was golden and thin, and when she broke it open, the inside was light and full of small holes, the way good bread should be. She sat at the counter and ate a piece. It was warm and simple, and it tasted the way she imagined bread should taste, like flour and heat and time. It was not perfect. It was not Irena's bread yet, but it was real, and she had made it with her own hands, and she felt something quiet settle in her chest. Not pride exactly, but a kind of recognition. She was beginning to understand. She baked 3 more loaves that day and left them on the counter to cool. She wasn't planning to sell them. She didn't even know if anyone would come. But the next morning, Joseph appeared at the door again. He had brought a woman with him, his wife, Maria. Maria was short and round-faced, with bright eyes and a warm voice that filled the room the moment she spoke. She looked at the loaves on the counter and picked one up. She held it close to her face and smelled it. Her eyes closed for a moment. Then she looked at Clara and smiled. She told Clara it smelled like it used to. Not exactly the same, she said, but close enough to make her remember. Word spread slowly, the way things move in small towns, not through announcements or advertisements, but through conversations at kitchen tables and over garden fences. Joseph told his neighbors. Maria told the women she met at the Wednesday market. A few people began to appear at the bakery in the mornings. Not many, just 2 or 3 at first. They came because they were curious, or because they had known Irena, or simply because they had heard that someone was baking bread again in the old shop on the corner. Clara was nervous at first. She woke up early to bake, and she worried constantly that the bread would not be good enough. Some days it was not. She would take a loaf from the oven and know immediately that something was wrong. The crust too hard, the inside too dense, the flavor flat and lifeless. On those days, she did not sell the bad loaves. She ate them herself or gave them to Joseph's dog, a large brown animal named Biscuit, who did not seem to mind the quality at all. But other days, the bread was good. On those days, people came back. They stood at the counter and talked to her while she wrapped their loaves in brown paper, and they told her things about Irena that Clara had never known. One woman told her that Irena used to give free bread to families who could not pay, and that she never told anyone about it.
A young man told her that he had eaten Irina's bread every morning of his childhood, and that the smell of a warm loaf still reminded him of home, even now, 20 years later. An older woman told her that Irina had baked a special loaf for her wedding 40 years ago, decorated with a pattern of wheat on the crust, and that she had kept the handwritten recipe card Irina had given her as a wedding gift. Each story added something to Clara's understanding. She was not just learning how to bake, she was learning who her grandmother had been. Not the quiet old woman she had visited twice a year as a child, but the person who had stood in this exact spot for decades, feeding people and listening to them, and being part of their lives in a way that was so ordinary it was almost invisible. Irina had not been famous, she had not been wealthy, but she had been necessary in the way that air is necessary, something you only notice when it is gone. Clara began to read the recipe book differently after that. The notes in the margins were not just memories, they were instructions for a kind of life, a life built around small, repeated acts of care, a life measured not in achievements, but in loaves. She had spent 2 years in an office measuring her worth in reports and deadlines and performance reviews. Here, the measure was simpler. Either the bread was good or it was not. Either the person at the counter left with something warm in their hands or they did not. There was no way to pretend. The bread told the truth every time.
By the end of the second month, Clara had settled into a rhythm. She baked 4 days a week. Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, she made 3 kinds of bread: the white loaf, a dark rye that had been Irina's most famous recipe, and a seeded loaf that Clara had created herself, using sunflower and pumpkin seeds from the market. The seeded loaf had not been in the recipe book. It was her own addition, and she had been nervous about it at first, afraid that people would think she was changing something that should not be changed. But Joseph tried it and nodded without hesitation. Maria bought 2 loaves of it the next week and told her neighbors about it. A young couple who had just moved to the town told Clara it was the best bread they had ever had. Slowly, she began to understand that keeping the bakery alive did not mean making everything exactly the way Irina had made it. It meant carrying the same care forward while also bringing something of her own. She pinned a photograph next to the one of Irina, a picture of herself taken by Maria one Saturday morning, standing behind the same counter with flour on her apron and a loaf in her hands. She was not smiling in the same way Irina was. Her expression was more uncertain, more searching, but she was there. That was what mattered. One afternoon, she found a note in the very last page of the recipe book. It was written in Irina's handwriting, but the ink was newer than the rest, darker, fresher. It must have been written not long before she died. The note said, "Clara, if you are reading this, you have come. I knew you would. Do not try to be me. Be yourself. The bread will find its way." Clara sat at the counter and read the note 3 times. She felt her eyes sting, but she did not cry. She simply sat there, holding the book, and thought about the woman who had written those words, a woman who had known her better than Clara had known herself. Irina had known she would come. She had known before Clara had even considered it. She had written these words and placed them at the end of the book like a light left on in a window for someone who was still far away. Then she closed the book and placed both hands flat on the wooden surface of the counter. The wood was warm from the oven heat. It was the same wood Irina had touched every day, and Irina's mother before her. 3 generations of hands on the same counter, doing the same work, feeding the same town. Clara pressed her palms down and felt the warmth move into her skin.
She called her mother that evening and told her she was staying. Her mother was quiet for a moment, then asked if she was sure. Clara said she was not sure about anything, but she was staying anyway. Her mother laughed, a soft, understanding laugh, and told her that sounded exactly like something Irina would have said. The bakery was not a big success. It was not written about in newspapers or talked about on the internet. It was a small shop on a quiet street in a small town, and most days Clara sold just enough bread to cover her costs. But the people who came back, and the ones who came back brought others, And the ones who sat at the counter and waited for their loaf to be wrapped always seemed to leave a little differently than they had arrived, a little warmer, a little slower, a little more willing to talk to the person standing next to them. Clara did not fully understand this. She thought about it sometimes while she worked the dough, her hands moving in the slow, patient way she had taught them to move. She thought about Irena and about Joseph's words, that bread remembered the hands that made it. She was not sure if that was literally true, but she had noticed that on the days when she was calm and unhurried, when she let the dough rest and did not fight it, the bread was always better. And on the days when she was anxious or distracted, when she tried to move too fast, the bread knew. Maybe that was what Irena had meant. Not that the dough was alive, but that the way you did something mattered as much as what you did. The care you put in was the thing that people tasted. It was the thing that made them come back. She kneaded the dough slowly. The flour rose in small clouds around her hands. Outside the window, the street was beginning to fill with the ordinary sounds of a small town, a door opening, a bicycle bell, a voice calling a name. Clara shaped the loaf. She placed it in the oven. She waited. The bread would be ready when it was ready. She had learned not to rush it, and she was beginning to think that this was not just a lesson about bread. It was a lesson about everything, about work, about people, about the kind of life that is built not from one big decision, but from 1,000 small ones, repeated every day with care. The oven hummed, the flour settled. The street outside grew louder with the sound of footsteps and voices and the opening of doors. And in the old bakery on the corner, the bread was rising.